Well, welcome everyone. It's great to be with you all, even if it's merely virtual as compared to our usual time in lovely Aspen. I'm a little disappointed, as I'm sure you all are, that we're not in Aspen, Colorado at the St. Regis, but hopefully, as they say in the Middle East, inshallah, next year we will all gather together. I'm David Gross with Wiley Rein, and I have the honor of moderating this session, as I've had the honor of moderating many of the international panels for the Aspen Forum in the past. I'm particularly excited about this year's panel because we're going to be focusing on what is probably the most important, controversial, and difficult relationship, that is the US-China relationship. Before going further, I just want to make a couple of brief disclaimers. As I'm sure everybody knows, we are in the political season. And so I want to make sure that everyone understands that our panelists are speaking only for themselves. They're not speaking for their organizations. They're not speaking for any political parties or campaigns or anything else. We are asking them to speak based on their own experiences and their own perspectives. We have a very provocative title, A Digital Cold War, China and US Post-COVID. It is, I guess, provocative both because it invokes the Cold War of a few decades ago that many of us lived through and hope never to live through again. It's also, of course, hopeful in the sense that it talks about it being post-COVID. And we're all looking forward to the post-COVID world. I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that our relationship to China has undergone some very fundamental changes just in the past few years. Up until fairly recently, it was widely viewed that an increased interaction with China would provide important economic synergies between the market-based economies and traditional democracies and countries like China that would provide goods and services at lower prices and provide great benefits for all of our people. There was also a fundamental hope that the increased economic benefits that would accrue to the Chinese people would lead to a greater democratization of that country. Of course, that has now been rethought, and there's now a sense that we are in a fundamentally different world, that in fact China is a much more aggressive global player, both politically and militarily, as well as being a major player economically and in terms of the climate, global climate issues and the like. That has created a series of great challenges, both politically and technology and economically for all of us. And we're going to be discussing some of those challenges today. The format we're going to use is we're going to have brief presentations by our four terrific panelists, and we really do have four extraordinary panelists. I'll ask a few questions of them after each of their presentations, and then we'll be going to your questions, you in the audience. And as Scott indicated, please put your questions into the Slido system, and then we will read them and convey them off to our great panelists. And with that, let us begin. I'm going to call on Fiona Alexander to start us off with a few comments. Fiona?
Thank you very much, David, and thanks again for the invitation from CPI to participate in the conversation. I too am missing that August trip that we should take in Aspen and look forward to one day getting on a plane again. Not only is this the longest I've been home, it's the longest I've been in the country since 1998. So it's an entirely different lifestyle, I guess. But yeah, I mean, we are all in the same situation in that case. So maybe just to offer a few observations sort of on the conversation of the US and China and what's been sort of called a digital Cold War. And I know a lot of the folks online, I've looked at the participants, but I don't know everyone. So I'm going to base my observations on my almost 20-year career at NTIA where I worked in the international office there, and I did a great many interactions around the world, including with our Chinese colleagues under the leadership of David Gross as ambassador and others that followed. But I would just observe that I think we've, at least since my career started at NTIA in 2000, I feel like we've always been in a digital Cold War. It's just not been as obvious. And the point of reference I'll sort of start with is when we were engaged in the process of the World Summit on the Information Society, that summit of the UN in 2 phases, right? The 5-year process of that, where I got to spend some quality time with David and Dick Beard and others traveling the world. It was interesting that on every issue that was important to the United States, whether it was at the time in the role that I was working on, the domain name system in ICANN, or whether it was intellectual property rights, or whether it was cyber, or whether it was human rights, whatever it was, the Chinese were there, and they were not in agreement with the United States. They weren't the ones making the arguments in the room. Usually it would be other colleagues, a lot of times Brazil and others. But the Chinese strategically placed themselves, at least from my observation, opposite the United States on almost every issue in that 5-year summit preparatory process. But it was very low key. They were not the adversaries, and their approach was very kind of a quieter approach. And what's happened over the years since then is the conflict has become more public and the conflict has become more direct. I think as the systems have evolved, there's a lot more transparency in the negotiations, and the Chinese government itself has gotten much more organized. And actually, and a few years ago, I remember a colleague coming up to me at a meeting and giving me a hard copy of the Chinese government's, plan for internet governance. And it kind of was very much modeled off of what the administration had done that time on like an international cyber strategy. So again, I feel like the disagreements have been there. They're just much more obvious, and they're much more transparent and much more open. What has changed in recent years has been the difference of how this administration has approached it. So I had the privilege and pleasure of working across 4 administrations. I always enjoy things about every administration. I always don't like things about every administration. So, good and bad with everything. But this administration has decided that it's going to take a very different approach. And I think historically, when we looked at internet policy and tech policy, the commitment to the free flow of information and the free flow of goods and services and human rights really were at the heart of what US administration was pushing. And that seems to have shifted, in particular in the last year and a half, where national security is kind of at the heart of things. And also very much a go it alone kind of approach. It used to be that we would look to build coalitions and we would build allies and we'd bring people along either through the OECD or other processes. This administration has decided to do things differently. It's not up to me in this environment and in this panel to say whether it's good or bad. I'm just providing that observation. And whether you're talking about the administration's approach to 5G and the RFI that just went out from DoD, whether you're talking about the idea of clean networks, which very much is a Chinese approach to securing your networks, or whether we're talking about executive orders and apps, right? Which again, not a sort of American values approach to how to deal with the problem. It's just been different. And so the question is, what's going to be the consequence of this different approach? And my observation is that there's a massive leadership vacuum now in the international community and tech policy. The United States is no longer sort of standing up and being this sort of bastion of sort of these principles that it had been for the last 20 years. China has become much more active, has much more strategic, seems to have a much more plan in the different and in that, we'll see what happens. So I'll start with that and see where we go.
Thank you very much. Let me pick up on a couple of the things that that you mentioned, Fiona. Looking back at WSIS and the tradition of that was a post-Cold War in the sense that it was after the fall of the former Soviet Union and the like. But as you point out correctly, of course, that we've always had these series of tensions with regard to the focus and intent of what was that in the technology space particularly. One of the characteristics of the old Cold War was that it was really two-sided. It was the West versus communist countries, and in particular, and plus there was of course the G77 in the developing world, and the like. How do you see it as a person who has spent a lot of time negotiating in multilateral organizations? How do you see the situation today? Is it divided in that same sort of way, or is it now exploded into a much more multipolar type of political and technologically based universe?
So I would say it's the latter. It's much more of a multipolar environment. In particular, in the Cold War era that I've studied and understand, you had two blocks and you had competing blocks. In the approach that we have now, it's the U.S. versus China, and the U.S. doesn't have an ally base around it in most cases. Now, on a few things, and recently on the Huawei 5G stuff, you've started to see coalitions build around the Five Eyes, but you don't really have a Western bloc in the same way. And at the same time, you definitely have a very aggressive and empowered Brussels, right? You definitely have a European Union and a European philosophy on tech where human rights are at the core. So while the US and China potentially are sort of tussling over national security type of approaches and what works, Europe is continuing to push forward with regulation and legislation and approach that other countries then model, with the data protection regulation being probably the biggest example. But the Digital Services Act conversation that kicked off, I think, today in the European Parliament with the adoption of a few reports. I don't know if that was yesterday or today. So again, this power struggle that could be perceived between the US and China, the world is going to move forward. It could just move forward without us, and I don't know what that means for the technology sector based on what we've seen in the past.
You also mentioned clean networks, which is something that the U.S. State Department has really been very strong on leading and trying to convince various governments around the world and telecom carriers to ensure that they don't include Chinese equipment in their networks and so forth. Again, based on your experience with international organizations and the like, how is that being perceived generally? Is that something that people are very interested in? They've had some success, obviously, with European countries, with Sweden, for example, announcing just yesterday, I think, that they are going to ban Huawei and ZTE equipment from their networks for 5G and thereafter. How do you see this playing out? Is this something that's being well received, or is this something that is creating barriers for relationships with other governments?
I think it creates confusion with other governments in some cases, because again, if you look at the multilateral environment, and we're at the end of the day, it's about getting enough votes to get something through or having a majority, and you always have a Western bloc, and you always have different blocs. And for a lot of countries that sort of look to see which position they want, they look to understand. And for 2 decades or more, the US has espoused a certain approach and a certain philosophy, and people understand those principles. Now it looks like the US is completely changing its approach. And if you're then trying to convince, a third block of countries to support your perspective, if you're having a fight in the ITU or in the UN General Assembly or whoever it may be, I think it's much harder for those middle block of countries to figure out now which path they want to take. So I definitely think there'll be ramifications, for the foreign policy side of the digital space, but going forward, and we'll get a chance to see that firsthand next year when WTSA and other things happen at the ITU, and to see whether the U.S. is still credible in trying to offering up the approaches it's tried to do.
Terrific, thank you. And for those who are listening in, WTSA, the World Telecommunications Standardization Assembly, is a major international ITU event that focuses on standards issues. And I think we'll be talking a little bit later, perhaps, about some standards related matters as well. It was scheduled for November of this year in Hyderabad, India. It has been rescheduled to the end of February, beginning of March. In theory in Hyderabad, but it looks like it's being moved to Geneva. And it may in fact still be virtual or a hybrid rather than an in-person meeting, which will create a variety of interesting challenges for governments and for the ITU. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Aynne, you're next up to bat.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at the TPI. I'd like to thank Scott Walston and the Aspen Technology Policy Institute for this kind invitation, and Ambassador David Gross and the esteemed panelists for the chance to participate in this conversation. So my research focus is primarily on what US companies have to gain in their interactions with China. So in the kind of broader sense, what I'm most interested in is looking at how, within the context of the US-China tech Cold War, there are US corporate actors that are kind of caught between the country where they're domiciled and the country where they want to do business for the rest of the 21st century. And this is not an easy tension to manage. So US firms have a financial incentive to maintain access to the Chinese market, which in turn benefits US shareholders through market growth opportunities. The United States has very limited options to access the Chinese market without injecting, to curb access to the Chinese market and to curb Chinese access to the US market without injecting uncertainty into our own sector, which is currently bolstering the US economy during a terrible pandemic. So this is a very difficult situation. So it's not just about how do we make policy, it's about how does the US, which has historically had a relatively hands-off policy to tech firms, manage their relationships with other countries, and China in particular. Now, China, for its part, has a domestically self-sustaining tech ecosystem, at least in the context of apps and software. Hardware is a more complicated issue due to supply chain concerns, and we can talk about that during the Q&A. But China is taking clear steps to further enhance the self-sustaining nature of its tech ecosystem, which presents further challenges for US tech firms. Now, three key ways that the US can address can counter this challenge are to, number one, enhance transparency requirements for data storage and security domestically for all firms operating in the US. So when we're concerned about Chinese firms operating in the US, one of the major issues is how do we actually monitor what their behavior is and what they're doing? And the challenge is, if we look at, for example, the TikTok, Walmart, and Oracle deal, is that now we have a situation where it's possible for a US firm to actually cover the tracks of a Chinese firm that's operating within the US market. So if we enhance overall transparency, that presents an opportunity for greater transparency in the market as a whole, as well as to monitor Chinese firms operating in the US without banning things by fiat, like the executive orders against WeChat and TikTok. The second, and Fiona alluded to this, and I think this is really something that is essential to continue to really hit on, is to support US government agency participation in multi-stakeholder organizations to counter rising Chinese influence. So right now, in the multi-stakeholder context, US firms take a very active role, but as we can see, the interests of US firms are diverging between the country where they're domiciled and the country where they're trying to do business. So this creates a really interesting challenge, and I would argue that increased US government involvement could potentially have a benefit there. And then the third is to, again, alluding to what Fiona was talking about, to renew our commitment to work with allies and partners on issues of data governance, including a return to existing frameworks like the TPP, which is now CPTPP, which had a very rich data governance framework, which by pulling out of, the US lost an opportunity to really kind of balance out the regional data governance questions. Now, China, for its part, has been engaging in a wide variety of different strategies to localize data and to require US corporations that are participating in the market to follow ever increasingly challenging regulations. So in June 2017, they implemented a cybersecurity law, which serves as the baseline for a lot of present day guidelines, which requires data to be stored in China and to submit to and for corporations to submit to government conducted security checks. With Hong Kong's national security law on July 1st, we saw that the Chinese government is moving toward a kind of conception of extraterritorial enforcement. This was articulated within the Hong Kong national security law, but it's something that we can see as an area of interest and exploration for the PRC government. So what does that mean for US tech companies that are trying to operate within the Chinese and US markets? are they potentially subject to extraterritorial enforcement? We've already seen concerns from U.S. tech firms that are operating in Hong Kong over that. On July 3rd, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress released a draft data security law, which kind of enhanced national security oversight for data governance questions of firms that are operating within the Chinese context. Again, this is a draft law, but it's likely to come into effect. And so this is, again, really shoring up Chinese data localization abilities and the challenges that US firms face within the Chinese market, the kind of ever increasing bar to access, and the ever increasing amount of data that they have to be willing to share with Chinese government officials and Chinese government agencies as a condition of participation within the market. And then further shoring up this kind of this self-sustaining ecosystem within a hardware context was just on October 17th, the National People's Congress Standing Committee passed an export control law that limits the movement of military and dual-use tech from China. So again, really limiting the flow between China and the US. Now, this creates a lot of really interesting challenges for US firms that are trying to navigate in between these two markets. And the US has frankly not been stepping up to this challenge. What we've seen in terms of major regulation of Chinese tech firms operating in the US market has largely been banned by fiat. So entities lists, as well as executive orders banning individual companies like WeChat and TikTok, which have not really made it through the courts successfully and are currently the subject of significant litigation. So we need to think about other solutions to handle this challenge because US firms will still continue to want to operate in China, and the Chinese government is progressively making more strides to collect data from US firms. So I'd like to just go back to my initial 3 recommendations, and I'm happy to talk about a lot more of this. There's so many really fascinating cases about what's happening, but I want to make sure to be mindful of time. So in that sense, I urge, again, the enhancing transparency requirements for data storage and security domestically within the US, so that US firms have to follow clear regulations, and so that there are limitations based in the US about how they can operate in China. We can think about this as similar to anti-bribery statutes. Support US government agency participation in multi-stakeholder organizations, in addition to corporate participation, and again, renewing commitment to work with allies and partners on data governance issues. Thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. That was terrific and very comprehensive, and you've raised a whole series of interesting and challenging issues. Let me just pick off 1 or 2, and then we can move on and then come back to some of the other ones. You mentioned Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong issue is extraordinarily interesting, I think, for a variety of reasons. One is obviously it's an example of Beijing's attempt to reassert control in a very broad base, including some extraterritorial aspects. If you were advising a non-Chinese based company, would you advise them to stay out of Hong Kong now and go to places like Singapore and elsewhere? Or do you think that in fact it's going to be stable enough and predictable enough to actually continue to operate in a place like Hong Kong, which has always been a center for trade?
So I think this really becomes a judgment call about each individual company's capacity for tolerating risk. So as a comparatively risk-averse person, I would move my headquarters to Singapore. If I was a smaller startup that was very interested in kind of a global expansion and the opportunity to really make waves and had a higher tolerance for risk, then I might stay in Hong Kong. But the other concern that we have, particularly as it relates to being in Hong Kong, is increased pressure not just on companies but actually on individuals. So we just saw news of the Chinese government saying that they might, and this is in the PRC, this is in the mainland, this isn't in Hong Kong, but they might detain U.S. nationals in response to in response to trade issues. Now, this has been going on. I just was at a really fascinating talk by Gary Locke, and he was mentioning that this has been going on with Chinese Americans in China since he was ambassador. So this isn't a new thing, but the fact that it's being stated so boldly is an area of real concern. So it's not just about the safety of the business; it's about the safety of the people who are actually working in that business.
Okay, thank you. This is going to be a really interesting set of challenges across the board.
Yeah.
Changing a little bit, you also raised the role of the U.S. government with regard to, as you call it, multi-stakeholder institutions. I assume it includes both multi-stakeholder and multilateral institutions as well.
Yeah.
When you say that, is there anything in particular you think the U.S. government ought to do more of? They are present, but of course they have a lot of resource constraints, both personnel
Right.
as well as money. Are you advocating that a greater amount of our federal dollars should be allocated in that way, or are you thinking about something fundamentally different?
Yeah, so I recognize that this is a fundamentally controversial recommendation because the whole backbone of particularly multi-stakeholder organizations is that it's not government led. But what we're seeing in the Chinese context is that there's a huge amount of government pressure and a huge cash infusion to bring government officials as well as former government officials who now are technically in the private sector, but have like very close party ties, and maybe were formerly in the PLA and might still be in the PLA, but we're not really sure. So I think that, a lot of this idea of multi-stakeholderism is kind of coming apart, at least from a theoretical standpoint. Now, I advocate for much stronger and much greater investment by the U.S. government. And let's be honest, if this is a tech Cold War, if we're using the words Cold War, then funding a few more people to participate in these organizations, or more offices with people in State Department and in Department of Commerce who have expertise in Chinese tech, would not go askance. I mean, this is a way that we should be spending money if we are truly thinking about this in the Cold War framework. So that's my perspective.
No, terrific. That's a great segue to Samm, who has a lot of expertise in this area. Samm?
Thanks so much. It's a hard act to follow Fiona and Aynne, and a privilege to be on this panel of women talking about the digital Cold War. I want to talk about rising digital sovereignty in the United States, because I think that what's happened is not only are we beginning to mirror the things that we've long complained about that the Chinese government has done with things like the Clean Network Initiative, but I think particularly when it comes to digital sovereignty and the TikTok, Oracle, Walmart deal has gotten criticism for the threat to free speech and sort of blanket national security bans that could be reciprocated against US companies. But I think there's actually something even far more damaging, which is a reality we're going to have to reckon with, which is the precedent set, which legitimizes the operating model in China, particularly around foreign tech service providers and cloud service providers. The idea that if you are a multinational company, to operate around the world, and going back to Anne's point about where companies are domiciled versus where they are operating around the world, now we have a precedent for requiring sale of a domestic stake in the company to a local player, and or run your services in that country via a local player. Now, Chinese cyber scholars have actually written about the TikTok Oracle deal and compared it to the model that Apple uses with its partner to offer iCloud in Guizhou. And there are important distinctions between that model. But I think that what it's doing, and I was recently at a Track 2 dialogue with some very influential information security scholars and private sector leaders in China, is it's raised the question, okay, we've got rising concerns about data sovereignty, and we have multinational companies in the tech space. How do we reconcile these two things? Now we have a solution. We have a model. The requirements that we have for Apple iCloud and Guizhou, we now have been reinforced and legitimized by the TikTok Oracle deal. And so it raises important questions. I want to just highlight briefly 3 points, and these are recommendations that I've been working on developing for US policymakers on how to think through these issues. So one is the idea that not all data is the same. And I think what's happening in the US policy response right now is a blurring line between what are privacy concerns around data and what are national security concerns. And I think this in many ways was kicked off by the overhaul of CFIUS and the use of the evaluation of sensitive data, which explicitly conflates privacy and national security. But we need to really think more carefully about that. When we talk about mapping data to geography, you having geography determine where data flows, let's think more carefully about, are we talking about metadata? Are we talking about certain combinations of data? And where do we need to sort of disentangle distinct sets of risk? And if in doing so, and this is where I want to build on Anne's point about sort of multilateralism and working with allies and partners, there's a lot of hand waving around work with allies and partners. But this summer, as we were banning TikTok, the European Court of Justice invalidated Privacy Shield on the basis that data transfers across the Atlantic can't happen because of the overreach of US surveillance. So if we're going to do that, I think we really need to come up with a framework around how do we think about government access to data, not just in a US-China context, but in a US-EU context, in an India context. And is it possible to create a baseline that would allow the flow of certain kinds of commercial data? Not every type of data is sensitive to national security or creates massive privacy risks. So are there ways that governments, and I would say not even democracies, because if you look at the sort of where the digital economy is surging in the world, it's in places that frankly are not necessarily democracies, not just talking about China, but I'm talking about Southeast Asia and Brazil. And can we come up with a baseline to allow certain kinds of commercial data to flow? And here, Anne had mentioned China's draft data security law. As part of that law, one of the most important developments in that law is China is putting forward a data classification system. Now, this is going to create an enormous amount of regulatory headache and uncertainty when you start requiring at the national level categories of data that companies have to sift through. So I'm not saying that China is going about this in the way that we want to follow, although we're in the mode of following how China governs the internet at the moment. But I think there is something to think about can we carve out kinds of data that are not sensitive to national security and create more of these baseline frameworks, which could potentially allow us to work more with allies and partners in this very fraught space where the reality is rising digital sovereignty, not just from China, but increasing from the United States.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Fascinating set of ideas and thoughts. Samm, you talk to a lot of people across the political spectrum, and this rise of digital sovereignty here in the United States. Do you see that as a reflection of the current administration, or do you think this is something that will be broadly adopted going forward, regardless of the outcome on November 3rd?
I don't see a tangible change in this regard. I think there's bipartisan consensus. We hear phrases like data is the new oil. I think that statement is false. Data is not a scarce resource. Data is not zero sum. Just because I have more of it doesn't mean you have less of it. But I think from a bipartisan view, there is an understanding that this is a strategic resource. And that's a phrase that Chinese scholars are referring to data as a strategic resource and China as a data superpower. And I think in the US government as well, there's a growing view of sort of these coming data wars and how can the US be best positioned in that. And so I think that here it's also important to keep in mind winning these data wars, if we want to think about it in this sort of great power competition lens, also requires that US companies get access to large international diverse sets of data. So how do we best position ourselves to do that at a moment when I think US companies are seen as exploiting data? And whether that's true or not true is a subject for debate. I'm sure among people here who have different views on that. But there's a question to be raised of, if we're not seen as responsible custodians of data, are our companies going to be in positions to operate globally, or are we going to increasingly encounter rising digital sovereignty? I talk about the TikTok Oracle case, the Apple Guizhou case, there's the Microsoft Deutsche Telecom model, which again was floated to me in a conversation with Chinese scholars as this is the way to, give local, give local industry and local stakeholders more of a say in how their data is used. And I think this is going to add an incredible amount of cost and really thwart the benefits that global cloud computing has unlocked.
Gee, there's so much to unpack there. I think one of the core questions that people would have is, as you have these international discussions about different types of data having different degrees of sensitivity, is your vision that it would be most efficient and effective that each country should figure that out for themselves based on their values and their history and their economies? Or is this something, as you point out, because it really has a lot to do with the transmission of data across borders, that this should be handled in some sort of more multilateral or multi-stakeholder type of forum?
The problem is that I think the way that we will define sensitive national security data is going to be very different from the way the Chinese government would. I mean, just to give you an example, basic things like, for in the financial sector, for example, you want to know your customer and be able to sort of share data about customers to do fraud checks and that kind of thing. That's something that we might say that's commercial data that enables us to clamp down on cyber fraud and financial theft. But, from a Chinese government perspective, that is that national security data. So once you start kind of drilling down into the sectors is where I think it gets very difficult to come to consensus on how you create these carve-outs, if that's at all possible. So can we lower the threshold even more? I mean, can we say things like, and this is getting very mundane, but this is what matters, right? Things like payroll data and HR data. If you're a multinational, you need to be able to send that back to your global headquarters to operate globally, right? So can there be a carve out that can allow that kind of data to flow, even as we have these very divergent, understandings of data sovereignty?
Terrific. Miriam, last but not least by any stretch of the imagination, please. You're on mute. There you are.
Is that better?
Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you, David, and thank you for having me. It's really great to see everyone, even if it's virtually, and obviously next year it would be nice to do it in person. I just have to say, Samm thought she had a hard job following Fiona and Aynne, so I have to follow Fiona and Samm. I don't know what I did to deserve that, but in any case, let me offer a few thoughts on sort of the broad framework, which dovetails well with where David started us. We're obviously at a very important juncture. China poses a growing challenge and threat to the US economically, technically, and as David said, even militarily. There are more competitive and adversarial aspects to the relationship today than ever before. Although at the same time, there are areas where cooperation is in the US interest, and climate change is, I think, a great example of that. When we think of the competition, we see it cutting across trade, economic issues, technology, other areas as well as through regional and global influence and institutions. But also in addition, as we mentioned a bit already, with respect to standard setting and rulemaking. I think this situation is made even more challenging today by China's perception of a US decline, from the way we have seen the pandemic mishandled, over this year to America's withdrawal from global leadership in a number of areas in the last few years, leaving, unfortunately, a vacuum for China to try and fill. At the same time, I think recent actions by China, including the lack of transparency surrounding the spread of COVID, has opened up the eyes of more Americans to China's increasing authoritarianism. When we look at the landscape economically, there's already been growing concern that actions like the threat of Western intellectual property, forced tech transfers, state subsidies for state-owned enterprises in China and sectors that China wants to champion have already created a very difficult playing field. But there's also increasing concern about Chinese crackdowns in Hong Kong, in Western China, and also today we're seeing greater tensions with respect to Taiwan. I think overall this has resulted in greater mistrust across the US of China, and we've seen that reflected in polls that Pew and others have done. This has also created stronger bipartisan support in Congress for a tougher US approach. However, I don't think this is going to work effectively on a purely bilateral basis, purely US-China basis. As others on the panel have suggested, the US is going to have to work more closely with our allies than we have been. So while I personally don't find the Cold War analogy that apt, the Soviet threat was different in many ways, and Moscow was never the competitor that China is today. The need for allies and the need for partners is just as critical. So working with European allies and others, especially with democracies that have common concerns and interests, can help the US both shape the rules and enforce them. Rules that support fair competition, rules that support openness, for example. And such cooperation can also help the US build more secure and resilient supply chains. And I think especially with respect to technology, this kind of cooperation is essential because US export controls just do not work as well if foreign competitors can go out and make and export similar products to China. But I think also at the same time, to be able to compete strategically, economically, and technologically, the US also has to take a hard look at its own economy and to start investing more in it. Because boosting US competitiveness is key. It's not just against China, but against all economies with which we compete. And that means making more investments in our infrastructure, in innovation, in education, especially STEM. Keep in mind, it's not China that's responsible for our crumbling infrastructure or our failure to educate and train people and students properly for high-tech jobs, or US cuts to R&D. So in closing, I would say that the US should embrace a more coordinated, cohesive, holistic approach, both within our country and also with respect to our allies, to meet a variety of challenges that China poses today. I'll stop there.
Terrific. No, that's a great segue. You have a lot of experience, of course, with international discussions on trade-related matters and other types of things, and you touched on it just during your presentation. At the risk of stating the obvious, it's easy to say we should all coordinate, but of course it's very difficult because it's often there's a lot of after the high-level agreements, there's a lot of parochial views on these things. We've had a lot of issues, as you know better than anybody, with trade issues with Europe and with many of our close political allies. How would you recommend that we go about trying to work together on these critically important issues as a counterbalance to China and Russia and other authoritarian governments. There have been discussions about trying to create, for example, a new D10 or D12 of democracies trying to work together. Is that something, do you think, is realistic? Is it possible? Or are there some other alternatives?
Well, David, you know the negotiating landscape as well as anyone. The simple answer is we don't know if we don't try. But I also think, as some of my co-panelists have indicated, an approach that starts with my way or the highway isn't the way to deal with allies and try to build more common ground. So I think it starts with the US having a clear strategy of where it wants to go. And that includes who are you going to work with, on what terms, and then bringing partners along and making them feel like this is a collaboration. It's a goal that we can achieve together. And also at the same time explaining why it's in the common interest to do so.
I assume that an important part of that might be, a focus on human rights, and human rights as we think of it, not necessarily the way certain authoritarian governments use that term. And it seems to me that strikes me as being one of the ties that binds us very closely and may form some of that foundation, Miriam, that you're talking about. Let me ask you, and then I was going to ask all of our panelists, and then we've got a lot of questions, which is great. So Miriam, looking ahead over the next medium term, not this upcoming year, but down the road for the next 5-10 years, are you optimistic, pessimistic, or too early to know about whether or not we're going to come out of this in a way that we would feel comfortable and feeling that we, the United States, still have a true global leadership role?
Well, it's my nature to be optimistic, David. And so I am hopeful that we will really focus on making the investments that we need to in the US to boost our competitiveness, and that a more open, collaborative approach will bring our allies along to work with us closely. And we will be able to also cooperate with countries like China and others too, that don't see things eye to eye with us much of the time, but do appreciate that there is a need to cooperate on issues like climate change, like non-proliferation. So I think it's important we kind of keep our eye on both goals at the same time.
Terrific. Now let me open it up to the entire panel. Is there anybody who would like to make some comments about what others have said? I want to make this as interactive, and then we'll go to some of the questions from what we euphemistically call the virtual floor. Oh, Anne?
So first of all of these were such rich presentations that there's so much. I wish that we were actually in Aspen and we could sit down for drinks afterward and like really hash all of this out. I think it would be really valuable for U.S.-China relations. But I think that one of the so like Gramsci had this idea of optimism of the will, but pessimism of the intellect. And I think that that's kind of where I am about the current U.S.-China relationship. I agree with Miriam that there are a lot of ways where we can work. There are a lot of places where we not just can work together, but absolutely need to work together. I mean, in the context of climate change, without collaborative efforts between the U.S. and China, we have nothing. And this is also a tech question, not just a question of scientific collaboration. My big question, and one thing that I'm really curious and looking at, not just for tech, but also in media, another area that I cover, is when the US economy will be able to get back online. And we're seeing Chinese economic performance start to ramp up to a comparatively normal level. So I think that will determine a lot, at least from the corporate perspective. I think it will determine a lot of how this balance is able to work out over the next 5 to 10 years.
Very good. Others have comments along those lines? I would note that, obviously the Chinese economy appears, if you believe their numbers, to be rebounding fairly strongly. Europe is struggling. Some of our percentage increases are pretty good, but we're still way behind where we once were. Fiona?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. I can't remember who said this over the course of the session so far, but the question was whether there would be a different approach if the administration changed or domestic politics changed. And I would argue that the diagnosis of the problem is consistent party line, right? Whether which party you're in, everyone agrees we have a problem and everyone agrees there's a threat. I think the solution set and the approach of the solution set is very different based on party and different and approach. And one is much more, as Miriam described, in terms of looking to work with allies and sort of leaning into institutions, and the other is not. And again, they're different approaches. You can argue the merits of both, but I think that that definitely changes the dynamics going forward, depending on what happens in the next few weeks here, and in the next couple of years as well.
Very good. Actually, that leads into, I'm going to go to some of the questions from the floor in no particular order. One of the questions, though, is that in the changing US and China relationship, how does Europe affect the balance? And this goes a little bit to the point you all were just making. Are they less relevant, or do they tip the scales in multilateral discussions? Sam, what's your sense?
I mean, I think that we'll need to be in damage control with the transatlantic relationship. Europe is very relevant. The tech competition between China and the US is increasingly playing out, not in those countries, but in places like Europe, in India and elsewhere, right? So Europe is very relevant. And this is where I think it's important to sort of, I'm not a European expert, so I defer to those who are, but from comments I've heard from EU officials who will say things like, our challenge is not to make Europe appear more like China or more like the United States, but more like Europe. And this sort of increasing concern that the majority of cloud service providers are either Chinese or American companies. I think that perspective is driving a lot of the approach. So it's going to be very, very important. And going into sort of damage control in the transatlantic relationship is going to be a vital first step. And Fiona, I think you're right. I think that there is, from a potential Biden administration, an intent to do that. But there's some very deep obstacles that will need to mix all my metaphors at once, deep obstacles to be crossed in order to do that.
Miriam, you've spent a lot of time negotiating with our European friends. How do you think they see themselves in this, and how should we see them?
I think we've seen over the last few years that they have gotten much more concerned about the national security implications of being too accommodating to China. We've seen just in the last several months that they too have taken a much stronger approach to dealing with Huawei, for example. So I think, Europe has a lot of challenges in terms of coordination and, having so many sovereign countries agree on approaches at the commission level, at the regional level, but the US has been able to work both with individual countries and with the Commission as a whole to try to find more common ground. And I think it's just starting. I think there's much more potential to do that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it starts from the basic approach of let's do this together rather than here's what we want you to do. And if you don't do it, we're not going to talk to you. So I really do think it has got to be a much more collaborative effort. And I think there's potential to do that. And we've seen a little bit of that already, but I think there's much more that we could do together.
Sam?
To add on to that, I think we need to also sort of not treat tech as one monolithic thing. And oftentimes the conversation about Europe and the US and China always focuses on Huawei. And yes, Huawei is a big deal, but there's a lot of other areas where I think we're going to need to work through some real tough issues: data privacy, norms and standards around AI ethics. joint research and development. And I think, I was just on a call with a colleague this morning who was saying in Germany, for example, German companies are actually doubling down on R&D and localization in China, in sectors like life sciences and auto and consumer. So, yes, I think we've seen the Europeans in many cases come around on the Huawei issue, but there's a lot of different ways to splice this technology issue. And it's going to be quite challenging.
Yeah, I would note along those lines, I think it's a very excellent points. The Chinese have not been shy of tying their direct foreign investment into various countries to and the access that foreign companies have into China to these very issues. And of course, many European countries receive a lot of foreign direct investment from Chinese or Chinese-based enterprises. And of course, China, as it is for the US, China is a very big market for European companies. I saw a piece a little while ago during the 5G debate in Germany that the Chinese were threatening access to China for German car manufacturers, which of course is a very large market for them. So they know how to play this game in a very straightforward fashion. Anne? Oh, okay, very good. Yes.
I would just add that we have seen European countries strengthen their screening procedures for foreign investment, and those that didn't have procedures before are now moving towards adopting them. And we've also seen movement at the commission-wide level. So again, I think Europe is waking up to some of the concerns that the US has had earlier.
That's excellent. So here's a question that feeds all of our optimistic approaches, which is there a way for the US and China competition to become a positive sum rather than a zero-sum game? Is there a way for policymakers to shift the equilibrium? Now, that will require some creativity. Fiona, you have a lot of experience finding good results with Chinese negotiators.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and one that I think we'll be struggling with for a little bit here in the US. I might just offer that the only way to actually do that is to sit down and talk to the people that you have a difference of opinion with, and not just once. Maybe I'm hearing you in my ear. Talk often to the people that you don't understand or don't understand you. And maybe that's the only way to kind of come to conclusion. And this is where places like the Internet Governance Forum or other stakeholder venues that are not as high pressure, that don't have these governmental outputs that are negotiated, are maybe good places to do it, or bilateral conversations. So I think if you're going to try to get to a win-win situation, or at least away from zero sum, you've got to find a way to at least find a small thing where you can both get something that you want. And the only way to do that is to talk to people.
Miriam, you also have a lot of experience in these types of negotiations.
I would go back to what I think is a really important point, that this is a wake-up call, and we really need to look at our own economy and the incentives that we're providing or not providing, and how are we going to repair our infrastructure and improve our educational system, which once was the envy of the world. How are we going to restore R&D budgets? And keeping our technological edge depends on keeping our innovative edge. And so I think this is a chance for us to really look hard and decide we are going to make these investments. And if we don't, it's going to be a different scenario.
Anne?
Yeah, so building on what both Fiona and Miriam said, I think that I see two kind of really important parallel paths. So building on what Fiona said, I think it's really important to recognize that there's a wide diversity of opinion within the Chinese tech policy landscape. It might not be expressed in public forums, but in private conversations, there are people who have different views about government control. And also among Chinese industrialists and tech entrepreneurs, there has been even public pushback from government with regard to government control. So I think one important thing is to really engage with a broad range of Chinese stakeholders who may be more effective at influencing how Chinese policy goes internally than the US would be doing so externally. Now, the other thing, building on Miriam's point, is this idea that, part of the strength of the engine of the American educational system and research and development system is that there were and continue to be really rich, talented people who come to the US to be trained, and who in a lot of cases have very fond memories and very fond experiences here. And when and if they go back to China, take those memories and take those experiences back. Now, I think we've shifted really far into the other direction of, kind of suspicion. And as a result of that, we are losing those people who might actually be advocates within the Chinese system for greater openness, greater transparency, and for a kind of focus on democratic values in a tech landscape. So, I mean, that is like my highly optimistic view. I know that there are a lot of people who would disagree with me on that, but as an educator, I'm gonna keep banging that drum as long as people will hear me. So.
Well, certainly, I think, that has been always the traditional US view, that we want to have people come here, experience the wonders that are the United States, and go home, if they don't stay, go home and feel good about us. Obviously, over the past, let's say 2 years or so, presumably longer, but certainly in the last 2 years, with great visibility, there have been a whole bunch of indictments of academics and others who have come here, who apparently have not been, at least according to the indictments, playing by the rules that we would hope would be. What do you think about, how do you deal with that? And you're at UVA. How in academia do you deal with that type of issue? Because obviously you want the best and the brightest to come here, help us, go back, work collaboratively. That's been true for many years, and it was actually true during the height of the Cold War. My father was an academic physicist at Columbia, and many of his close colleagues were in the former Soviet Union, and that was always very tricky to how to deal with that. But that was always, with U.S. government oversight and approval, that was something that was done. Are we going back to that, or are we just going to have to feel our way through? Yeah.
So I think that this gets back to what Samm was talking about, with the need for a lot of nuance and a lot of attention paid to like what specific disciplines, what specific areas. So one thing I'd like to point out is there's been a lot of focus on Chinese students, but some of the most egregious offenders have been actually leading US scientists and physicians. So I'm thinking of the case at Harvard. I'm thinking of the case in Tampa, the oncology team. I mean, these aren't foreign students who came and swiped a bunch of research. These are American academics. And so there's a certain element of, racism and xenophobia that plays into concerns that, undergraduates or first year MA students are going to be, taking all of our intellectual property. I mean, there have been cases, especially at the postdoctoral level. I think that's when things get a lot more unclear, even at the PhD level in certain very strategic industry, in very certain strategic fields. I mean, nanotech is one area where we can think of this. Biomedicine, biomedical sciences are another area where there's some concern. So I think that there needs to be very nuanced cooperation with people in the field who understand what type of information is strategic, and what type of strategic and difficult to access, and what type of information is available in scientific journals. But that requires, as Samm mentioned, a lot of careful nuance. Then there are other areas, like in my field in the social sciences, where, I think the more Chinese students who come to study the social sciences and humanities in the US, the better. We're looking at people learning about global history from an American perspective, learning about Western literature. I mean, these are really strategic. Like, if you want to think about education solely in a strategic standpoint, which I don't want to necessarily, but I will for the purposes of this context, those are huge advantages to shift how elites in China think about the world. So I think, in that sense, we should be welcoming people.
Samm, let me ask you a sort of a corollary question to this. we have now a view on all these issues that China, that our original approach to China, that is the idea that it would perhaps democratize over time, that a greater standard of living would encourage a greater, closer cooperation between China and the West, including the United States. Is the shift because of President Xi? Is he the reason, and in fact, China really isn't very different than we thought it was going to be? Or is he really a reflection of where China really is? In other words, is the elite, political elite, accurately reflecting the views of the greater China? Or is it something separate, and that this is really a blip in the road between something and we're overreacting?
So I think there are two distinct issues here. One is that we have definitely seen a shift towards more repression and sort of entrenchment of authoritarianism in really disturbing ways under the Xi Jinping government. But I think I just want to question the sort of basis of the assumption that engagement and economic interdependence with China was about democratizing China. I don't think that's what it was about. And I hear that from like the Matt Pottingers of the world that are trying to justify Trump administration policies and this dramatic turn. And I think engagement was always a strategic thing. It was about containment relative to the Soviet Union. And it was about US strategic interests. It was never, I think that for those of us who, if anyone had an illusion that China was going to democratize, I mean, I feel sorry. Like, no, I don't think it was ever about that, right? And then on the point of sort of what do elites and sort of liberals and progressives in China think, I mean, frankly, we have alienated sort of liberal elites in China. With this current approach, Xi Jinping is not going to be around forever. And yes, his government has taken a really terrible turn in many ways, but he's not going to be around forever. And what's happened is when he isn't in charge, I think for that next generation of liberals and progressives, they have become far more nationalistic because of our own actions in ways that they could have been beneficial to us sort of in a potential post-Xi Jinping era. And the rhetoric around regime change in China has been really damaging from a strategic standpoint.
Interesting. And Miriam, as you look at these things and looking ahead, and based on what Samm was saying, which I think is often widely agreed upon, how do you see, how can we fix this? That is it a question of just being more realistic in our expectations? Is it a question of trying to readjust our approach, either get even tougher to defend our interests, or is it a question of trying to find greater common ground?
It's a combination of being very aware of the landscape, very honest about the way China has changed and what our interests are. It's a willingness to engage with them where we need to, but also to be tough where they're not playing by the rules. And again, part of that is laying out our expectations very clearly with a clear strategy to achieve them. But it's also working much more collaboratively with our allies on the strategy and how we're going to get there. Because just as with the Soviet Union, we were much more effective by building an alliance and working with other democracies than we would have been going it alone. And I think that same approach has some relevance here as well.
Let me ask a question for everybody, and I think this will probably end up being close to our last question. China has focused a lot on trying to be viewed as a friend, a development friend for the developing world, whether it's Africa, South Asia, and Central Asia and the like. Is that going to work out well for them, or is this really putting to another day a set of problems based upon their making for a very complicated economic relationship with a lot of these countries? And I mention that in part because, as everyone knows, tech has played an important role whether it's Huawei, ZTE, or other technology companies, Chinese technology companies, as being part of that beachfront for deepening the relationship between China and the developing world. Is that going to work out well for them, or is that something which we should be addressing directly? Fiona, if you wouldn't mind starting, and then we can go to Anne and around the horn.
Sure. Obviously, just sort of speculating because no one knows for sure what the future will hold in this case. I would say that it could be uneven. I don't know that Africa and the developing world is monolithic, right? Every country is different, and the relationships that they've taken on board with China, whether it's economic engagement or technology equipment or things, could be very different depending on their own state of economy. There has been historically some unhappiness. I remember several years ago in the context of the ITU, we had a big fight about development of an ITU standard or mark on a piece of equipment to certify that it was good. And that was in great response to a lot of African countries' complaints that China had dumped bad equipment on their continent, right? So I think it just depends and will be issue specific. I will say that I think the US approach to Africa has been lacking for a long time, and it needs to be coordinated, and we need to spend some time with that part of the world as well as with Latin America, regardless of how the election turns out. I think that's been a problem and not very focused for quite a long time with us. But again, I think it will be uneven. So I don't think it's something that can be counted on. If I was in my old job in the Chinese government, I wouldn't be counting on those relationships to deliver things for me. So.
Right. Anne, and maybe others can also, a part of this, and I should have said it earlier on, is, China has had an approach of trying to capture the senior positions, if not the heads of various international organizations. We saw this at the ITU. We've seen this with a recent WIPO election and the like. And that's obviously, these things are all tied together. And so I just want to make sure as we look at this, this is obviously a geopolitical imperative by the Chinese government, has been for a while, how it fits into our approach. Yeah.
So I want to echo what Fiona said about the kind of unevenness. So we're seeing already kind of established regional data governance frameworks that China is leading. So for example, through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes several of its Central Asian neighbors, that is one place where they've already been kind of espousing Chinese government-led regional standards. So I think we're seeing that kind of move a little bit forward. Then in cases like the African Union headquarters, there was a lot of really serious pushback to Chinese government spying and tech investment. I think a lot of what this will depend on is the democratic norms in individual countries. So how much strength there is with each individual country to be able to push back. So a colleague at GW has done some really interesting work about different countries in Latin America and their responses to Chinese Belt and Road contracts more broadly. And what he found was that the countries with stronger contract law were able to respond better to predatory practices in terms of a broad range of investments. So I think that idea works really well within a tech landscape as well. So is there any kind of infrastructure to oversee or to regulate Chinese tech investment?
Terrific. Sam?
Sorry, I had an unstable internet connection, so I'm joining right now. I want to speak actually to a specific area, which is the so-called export of digital authoritarianism, which has become a kind of phrase that's cited a lot in think tanks and other sort of policy reports. And I want to sort of push back on the idea that China is intentionally exporting its internet governance model. We know for sure that there is demand for Chinese ICT equipment. It is used for surveillance in all kinds of authoritarian governments around the world. But I have yet to see specific evidence of an intentional desire by the Chinese government to export a governance model with that. And I wonder how much of this is more about demand. There is demand for surveillance equipment, and the Chinese government and Chinese companies are there to fill that demand. But is there as well as sort of push on the governance side? And I know that that's been sort of talked about and is widely cited, but I am yet to sort of buy into the export of the governance model so much as, you know, if other governments want to adopt digital sovereignty in a way that looks like and legitimizes China's system, great. But it's not necessarily something that I think is a high priority for this government. And it's all the more reason why I think the US needs to stand up. If we want our vision of internet governance to be attractive around the world, it's all the more reason why I think we need to stand up and offer something that's a more compelling alternative.
Sure. I know Fiona wanted to respond, and then we'll go to Miriam.
Yeah, just to sort of respond to what Sam just said. So I have seen lots of evidence of the Chinese government trying to export their version of internet policy, internet governance. And the reason you probably haven't seen it as much is because it happens in closed door government negotiations. So you can do an assessment of G7 or G20 statements over the years and see how the wording is used. And in earlier things, we had much stronger statements, and over the years, you'll see when there's not a reference at all, it's because some country has demanded it be excluded. And in the G7, G20 environment, if you don't agree, it's consensus, it comes out. So we've had lots of fights over the last 10 to 12 years with governments and with the Chinese government insisting on particular word choices, not accepting the reference to multi-stakeholder, insisting it be multilateral and multi-stakeholder. So they definitely have been strong advocates of making it, at least that the sort of soft law norms and rhetoric around this philosophy captures what they're looking for. So,
Terrific. Miriam, you get the last word.
All right. I would say I agree with what was said about the need for the US to provide an alternative, to show the leadership that offers a different vision, a vision that we embrace. And I think that carries over not only from internet governance, but also to what we can call Chinese foreign assistance. So it goes to your point earlier, David, about how are other governments viewing China. I think increasingly they're waking up to the fact that Chinese assistance comes with strings. And even pre-COVID might not have been in their short or certainly long-term interests. I think post-COVID, other governments are also seeing China with more suspicion. Much of the world, maybe not China, but much of the world is still suffering from the pandemic. We're facing the third surge now in the United States. There's a resurgence in Europe. And whether it's India or countries in South America, other countries are also still greatly and gravely affected by the pandemic. So there's a new awareness and a new wariness. And again, the flip side of that is being able to show US leadership and working with partners and allies in Europe, as we've discussed, but also South America, in Africa, Southeast Asia, and again, making sure that we have the strongest possible relationships around the world.
Wonderful. Well, let me thank our panelists, thank TPI and the organizers of the Aspen Forum once again for a terrific program. It's been very rich. The only thing that would have made it better is, as every panelist has pointed out, if we had only been in Aspen in August with a drink in our hands, it would have been even better. But in any event, this was very rich, as people like to say, and very useful, I think, and hopefully reasonably entertaining for everybody else. So with that, thank you very much, and look forward to seeing everybody next year, if not well before that. Thank you very much.
Sounds good.